Hello, dear listener. This is the part of podcast where I usually, or Melvin usually, tells you how you can support the show. Sometimes we talk about it in depth. We're not going to do that today. If you would like to support the Life of X, please head over to lifeofxpodcast.com and visit our support page. Thank you very much. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Ben Shapiro.
And that makes this the Life of X. If you have listened to part one of our series on Samuel Zemurray, you'll know that I'm joined today by my good friend, Markus Schoof, and he has been helping me talk about the life and times of the banana man, Sam Zemurray. When we last left off in part one of the Life of Sam Zemurray, we talked about Sam's early life and his rise to be a competitor of United Fruit. And right at the end there, we left off with Sam buying out his partner, Ashbel Hubbard, using gangster money. Now he owns 90% of his company, while United Fruit owns 10%. And he has become a relatively major competitor in that game. Markus, is there anything you want to interject about the last episode before we continue with our story?
No, it was a pleasure seeing you last week, and I loved it.
Fantastic. I like the title of the chapter from Cohen's book that we're basically starting in on, and it is Revolutin, which is apparently how Lee Christmas, who we'll discuss a little bit, referred to whenever Sam was going to overthrow a government. It was Revolutin as a verb.
Right.
So with that, Markus, please talk to us about Revolutin.
Okay, so Honduras was in a tight spot just as Sam was getting to Honduras. The Honduran government had borrowed a lot of money from Great Britain with the idea that they would have a national railway, but unfortunately for them, and perhaps to the fortune of British investors, that national railway actually went bust. So Great Britain never really completed its promise, or the investors didn't, never really fulfilled their promise of building a railroad. That's one of the reasons why Tegucigalpa, which is the capital of Honduras, still hasn't any railroad until today, one of the very few capitals in the world. And so, whereas the Honduran railroad network was not completed to the satisfaction of Hondurans, debt was debt, and the bonds continued to compound for over 40 years.
I can't believe that it just kept going for 40 years. What I just interrupted Markus saying was that there was then a threat of military action by the British. But to me, it is insane. They waited for 40 years and let this debt continue to compound. You know what I mean? You would have thought that, I don't know, within a decade, I don't know, a few years, that you would have been knocking on their door, but I guess not.
Yeah, I guess the idea here was that compounding debt is compounding debt, and it was a lower risk, at least so it seemed at the time to the British, to just keep making money by doing nothing than to threaten invasion. And, of course, as many Europeans had experienced in the 19th century, threatening war or invasion in Latin America could have consequences, because the United States, ever since the Monroe Doctrine was announced in 1823, at least nominally, had threatened Europeans with consequences were they to interfere in Latin American affairs, which was seen as the U.S. backyard.
And can you, for the people who are maybe not aware, talk about what the Monroe Doctrine was?
Yeah, so it's a very simple idea. Basically, as Latin American countries were fighting for their independence in the early 1820s and starting to gain it, and Napoleon had been defeated in Europe, some European powers were thinking about putting together an alliance to bring Europe back to power in Latin America, to carve out their own spheres of influence. And what the president at the time, John Monroe, put together, and his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, especially Adams really deserves the credit, was the idea that Europe was for Europe, and the so-called New World, the Western Hemisphere, was for Americans, and Europeans were not to interfere in those affairs. In reality, however, it was somewhat of a feckless warning, because there were several occasions in which Europeans actually did invade Latin America again, also the Caribbean. The British obviously held onto their West Indian colonies, for instance, until the 1950s, 1960s. Jamaica didn't become an independent country until the late 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, definitely around that time. And also you had the French invading Mexico while the United States was distracted with the Civil War. But nonetheless, at least on paper, it was this warning that if you interfere with us, consequences will happen. We might go to war by protecting what we deem our sphere of influence. Now, in a certain way, of course, Latin Americans appreciated that idea at the time because they thought, oh, by keeping Europeans out, we're going to become more independent. But the reality was that very often Americans assumed a more informal role as imperial powers in Latin America of what Europeans had represented decades and centuries before. So holding on to this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, the president at the time, President Taft, who had succeeded TR in 1909, 1913, the idea by Taft was to uphold the Monroe Doctrine by warning the British, yes, we realize that Honduras owes you money, but we're not going to allow you to invade Honduras. This is not the 1860s where France, Spain had invaded Mexico. This is a different century. This is the American century. Obviously, he didn't know it was going to be the American century, but that's the idea. We are the largest power on the planet. We are Americans. You're staying out of here. And what really came together was a compromise by Taft, by Secretary of State Philander Knox, and really, interestingly, a financier, J.P. Morgan.
Who listeners will recognize from our series on Andrew Carnegie.
Exactly. A very important financier, as all of you remember, who really also speaks to the times in which private powers, private investors like Morgan had extraordinary power to influence political maneuverings. This is prior to the New Deal, in which those kind of interests were curbed. Now, Wilson had done something to curb the power of people like Morgan, and TR had done something as well to some degree earlier, but nonetheless, those people were extraordinarily powerful in power brokers. So what President Taft really represented was a dollar diplomacy. Now, what was the dollar diplomacy? It really was an attempt by the United States to quote-unquote substitute dollars for bullets. So instead of sending U.S. soldiers to Latin America to occupy, you would just try to send a lot of money into there or put certain people in charge to control or at least influence. It wouldn't have said control, because, of course, Americans never thought of themselves as an empire, but rather as those who represented everyone's best interests. But the idea was here that instead of sending soldiers, you just apply your financial capital to help everyone out. That at least was the idea. And so in a specific case, what now we call the Knox Plan, but really was J.P. Morgan's plan, if you think about it, the plan was to solve this dilemma of rather than sending U.S. soldiers to fight Great Britain or U.S. soldiers invading, that you would sit together the governments and that J.P. Morgan, which is incredible to think about, but he was so wealthy to just assume most of the Honduran debt. Just think about that today. Could be done, of course. The Walton family could easily take on a lot of debt of a lot of countries, but that's exactly the thinking here. It wouldn't happen.
And I thought it was insane, like this whole idea of the Knox Plan and Morgan's role, if I recall correctly, and feel free to interject if I'm getting something wrong, but they were basically going to insert themselves between the taxes and whatever money was owed to the Honduran government and the money that was owed to the British. And they were going to take their cut before the Honduran government got it, which is like a giant violation of Honduran sovereignty.
Exactly.
In my opinion. And from reading Cohen, it seemed like that was kind of the opinion of a lot of Hondurans too.
Exactly. And that's exactly from the playbook of what had happened under TR. 1905, 1906, which the same thing had happened with the Dominican Republic. Americans just occupied their customs house and said, okay, from all the duties that you get, from the taxes of the imports and exports, we're going to take our cut. In return, you get financial stability and nobody's going to invade you. But here, we want our debt back. And that, of course, upset Dominicans in 1905, 1906, and obviously upset Hondurans in 1911. And, important to our story, it upset Sam Zemurray.
Yeah, because this would have then basically done away with all of those concessions that his company was getting. And like we mentioned in the last episode, those concessions were basically the only thing that were keeping Sam in business.
Right. So here is Sam going, hey, you schmuck, I just had this amazing deal with Davila. What are you doing taking away my briberies and kickbacks? Because what Morgan and the Americans said was, well, you no longer get special treatment because guess what? We need your tax income from the bananas you are exporting. The fact that Morgan was going to take on the loan at the expense of Zemurray's really made Zemurray feel disgusted with Morgan, which is a little bit ironic, as we'll address in a second. Zemurray referred to Morgan's nasty trust, that's quote-unquote nasty trust, and pointed out that he, Zemurray, was not a favorite son of J.P. Morgan. So the irony, of course, is that Zemurray was disgusted with J.P. Morgan's financial power and also the fact that he was able to lobby in Congress, Whereas Zemurray himself, of course, had been lobbying for his kind of laws on behalf or at the same time as United Fruit Company himself. Morgan later on actually became a controversial figure in US history because in the 1930s, Major General Smedley Butler, himself a veteran of US meddling in Central America, accused JP Morgan of trying to undermine FDR. How did Morgan try to undermine FDR? Well, Morgan, like many other powerful Americans, and that's something we always have, of course, as a leitmotif in US history, whether it's Carnegie or Morgan or anyone else, Morgan and other elites opposed the New Deal to a certain degree and wanted Butler, who himself was a veteran of Central America, who had fought in Central America at many points, Morgan and other elites wanted Butler to assume an advisory role in Washington to curtail FDR's power and the New Deal agenda. The New Deal agenda generally being more pro-worker than pro-business. Now, what is the other connection here? And that's that Butler, as a veteran and major general in Latin America, himself later begrudgingly acknowledged that he had helped, quote, in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics, unquote.
And whereas Sam was certainly unhappy with J.P. Morgan and Philander Knox and his stupid plan, he was even more upset with Davila. That was because at this point, Davila was like, okay, I'll take the deal. And it's kind of interesting to point out that he didn't have much of a choice in this situation. You know, like what choice did he really have? He was truly between like a rock and a hard place.
Right. I mean, after all, the United States, as we had addressed, had threatened, undermined, or even overthrown leaders it didn't deem congenial. And so wasn't Davila better off without a U.S. invasion and taking the deal than maybe having either a British invasion or a U.S. invasion?
Yeah.
I mean,
So then back to Sam. He was not at all shy about how he felt about the Knox Plan. And one day when he's back in New Orleans, he gets what must have been a pretty surprising letter or telegram or correspondence, whatever, from Philander Knox himself, the Secretary of State, summoning him to Washington, D.C. And, you know, this is an interesting meeting that, you know, there's no minutes kept of or there's no recording of, but what had to be a fascinating meeting and one that Sam had talked about. So Cohen pulls from Sam's own records about what went down in this meeting. So we have to keep that in mind as we go through it. But basically, according to Sam, Knox told him that he needed to keep his nose out of U.S. foreign policy and that him losing his business was just going to be an unfortunate consequence of the Knox Plan, but he was to stay all the way out of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. And, you know, Sam was not the kind of guy to take that laying down. So he, who apparently hated lobbyists, began lobbying and hiring lobbyists and paying editors of magazines in Latin America and in the United States to start writing against the Knox Plan and talk about how it was a violation of Honduran sovereignty and how it was un-American and all of these things. And so basically using the tactics of the enemy against them.
And that's a strategy to which he would revert 40 years later again in the infamous overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala.
So having basically been called to D.C. by Knox to be dressed down and told that his business was over, Sam basically decides that there needs to be a change in the government of Honduras. And so he heads back to New Orleans, but Knox kind of realizes that Sam's not just going to go down without a fight. So he attaches Secret Service spies to him and anyone that he associates with in New Orleans. So he is basically always tailed by someone from the government. And when he gets back to New Orleans, he reaches out and he reaches out to a guy who might get his own episode at some point in the future. He is like one of those stranger than fiction people, super fun to read about. I don't know how much of it is totally exaggerated and all that, but the guy has Huck Finn level stories associated with him. And his name is Lee Christmas. And he was an associate of a man named General Manuel Bonilla. Marcus, would you like to talk to us about Lee Christmas and General Bonilla?
Yeah, of course. So Christmas really can be understood as a soldier of fortune. He had previously actually really made himself known to Bonilla by foiling an assassination plot. Now, who was General Bonilla? Bonilla had been a president prior to Davila, but basically had been pushed out of power and was kind of a famous character in New Orleans, in exile, living in exile, waiting to return. So Christmas, Bonilla, and Zemurray having similar objectives, which was to hold onto power and to make a good living in Honduras, all came together and plotted to kick out Davila and install Bonilla. How did they do that? Well, Christmas knew a lot of thugs, especially in New Orleans, and so he hired about 100 of them, but also workers who worked on United Fruit Corporation plantations in Central America. And all of those came together to try and overthrow Davila. The first attempt failed. And so basically, Zemurray resolved that he had to do more than just give money to Davila.
Just to interject on that first attempt, if I recall correctly in the book, it's like comically bad. They didn't have any business really trying. And it was just like such a pathetic attempt that they were like, if we're going to do this, we actually need to do it right. So please go ahead.
Exactly. And so Zemurray, instead of just giving money, actually bought a warship, which they could all use to sail to Honduras and plan a more concerted attack. And he also arrived with about $200,000. So a lot of money, several millions by today's standards.
Two things. I think it's very interesting that Sam Zemurray had enough money to just buy someone a warship. But then also, it's interesting, when you think of naval warfare and, what it takes, or what it took even, the idea that one single warship would have made that big of an impact kind of really speaks to I guess probably the state of like the Honduran Navy, I guess, if they had a Navy, or like their ability to contest any sort of naval powers. They are very lucky that it wasn't the British rolling up on them with their Royal Navy and it was just Zemurray.
Right, and add to that the layer what Zemurray had to pull off, and that was being stalked by the Secret Service. He had to basically engage in a cloak and dagger operation and leave as secretly, as clandestinely as he could from New Orleans.
Yeah, and it was interesting too in the book. Cohen talks about their actual flight from New Orleans and how the Hornet, which is that warship, it had a Secret Service agent on it for, I forget how long, but for like the first leg of the journey, just to make sure that they weren't doing anything clandestine. And finally, when he gets to a point where he's like, okay, like just finish going to Honduras, he gets off. And then Sam meets them in open waters and boards with like all these guns and everything like that.
Yes. Really, I think what partly speaks to this, how could Honduras be defeated by a guy and a few hundred soldiers? And I think that goes to the entire propaganda campaign and really beguiling figure that Zemurray was. And so, just like other war zones later on, the United States won through the CIA, basically through treachery and deception rather than to actual force. That's exactly what happened here. So one great example is that as the soldiers landed who tried to oust Davila, they often had to bluff in order to accomplish their goals. And one good example was that Lee Christmas sent a letter claiming that reinforcements were on their way when they were not. But he was so convincing that US diplomats caught onto the idea, then warned the Davila government, and the Davila government just cleared all its soldiers from a city that basically would never have been taken over. And that city was known as La Ceiba. A city, to add insult to injury, wasn't just strategically important, but also financially and economically important because it contained a lot of silver bars.
And loyal listeners to Life of X will remember from our series on Chiang Kai-shek how important silver was to many economies at this point in time. So basically, they run right through Honduras. Davila resigns, and Honduras holds a presidential election. I believe it was in 1912, and Bonilla was elected president. And first order of business, don't forget the hand that feeds you. He immediately sets up generous concessions for Sam and for Cuyamel Fruit. Sam was put in charge of handling the Honduran finances, but even he had some trouble trying to wrap his mind around chipping away at that accumulated debt. And as important as they may have been to this particular portion in history, Bonilla and Christmas kind of fade away from our story around here. In 1913, Bonilla ends up dying of some mysterious disease, and then Christmas just kind of floats around different parts of Latin America and the United States trying to get into these business ventures that just repeatedly fail, and he eventually fell into obscurity and died in the 1920s. But, it's interesting to think that in doing this, Zemurray had effectively betrayed the United States.
Yeah, and it goes to show how powerful he really was as a venture, because the government, instead of sending an expedition to kill him or anything along those lines, the U.S. government just cut its losses and acquiesced to the situation.
And it's interesting to try to think about it in today's terms, which is not a great parallel, but it would be like if Jeff Bezos was found to have been actively working against the foreign policy of the United States, like in the Middle East or something like that, and been allowed to just continue carrying on. Amazon, which just kept going, because that's basically what happens.
Right. Or imagine that Bezos wouldn't pay any federal income taxes on Amazon. I mean, that would never happen, right? But actually, if I think about this episode, in US Latin American history especially, it actually reminds me quite a bit of a situation that is more famous than one of Zemurray, and that's of William Walker in the 1850s. So Williams was an American mercenary, a filibusterer. A filibusterer really just means that you're acting against the will or without the explicit permission of your own government to create trouble somewhere else. And that's exactly what William Walker did in the 1850s. What he did was he made himself king, reestablished slavery in Nicaragua, which had been outlawed 20 years earlier, and basically also started a bunch of wars with other Central Americans. And all of this against the warnings by his own government. Now, where the difference is in our stories between William Walker in the 1850s and Zemurray in the 19-teens is that whereas Zemurray only had been reproached by Knox and the government had relented for his unsanctioned overthrow of a foreign government, Walker actually was executed by Central American troops in the 1860s.
So after Sam had completed this overthrow, he decided to stay in Honduras. There was work to be done now. It kind of strikes me as a little odd, but again, it kind of speaks to the singular-minded focus that Sam had, that he was willing to just stay in Honduras and leave Sarah and their 2 children in New Orleans. But that's exactly what he did. In Sam's mind, he was building an empire, and sacrifices needed to be made. He had a lot of people to pay back to. It wasn't just that he was cold-heartedly leaving his family. Remember, he'd borrowed a lot of money from gangsters. Like, he had to pay this money back. He didn't have a choice but to start making that money. And so he did, and business was booming. And by 1913, Sam had accumulated enough money to buy back United Fruit's 10% stake in Cuyamel fruit. Now, we talked about before, I know we've already touched on the banana tax, so we won't spend too much time talking about that, but 1913, the Wilson administration had enacted the banana tax, and United Fruit was none too happy about that, so they pushed back by hiring the lobbyists that we discussed before. So, kind of in response to the lobbying and the editorializing, the Justice Department started investigating United Fruit for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, in order to make it look like they weren't violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, they started allowing these people to buy them out of their own companies because they needed to look more legit. So there's been critics of this move by United Fruit to say that, letting Sam buy back that 10% stake was short-sighted, but they really didn't have much of a choice. Back to Sam, now that he owns the entirety of his entire company, he was on a mission. By 1915, he had acquired 20 ships. By 1921, he had acquired his father-in-law's entire fleet. Remember, we said that his father-in-law owned a fleet of his own and had been a banana man in the past. Also in 1921, he moved his headquarters to Puerto Cortes and bought up land in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Mexico. He began hedging against hurricanes. We talked about that as a major threat to the banana trade was, one hurricane comes through and it really wipes out your entire crop, you're in trouble. So he started hedging by beginning to plant and sell other crops. Cuyamel fruit was like a rising star at this point. It was small, it was nimble. Cohen really emphasizes the fact that by this point, United Fruit was so big, they'd kind of quit being innovators. Sam was nimble. Sam could move. It was sort of like the Blockbuster Netflix of the time, because while Blockbuster was doing all this business in VHS and DVD rental and all that sort of stuff, this little internet startup, Netflix, comes along. And while Blockbuster was established and had all this money coming in, Netflix was able to kind of move around it and see where the opportunities weren't capitalized.
Yeah, I just got a concern with your analogy because, first of all, do you know anyone with a Netflix subscription? And more importantly, there still are 2 Blockbuster shops left, one in Australia and one in Oregon.
Well, yeah, at this point, I will say, United Fruit still existed too. So
that's true.
So they were both there. My analogy holds.
Fair.
So even worse, the more ambitious among the people at United Fruit started going over to Cuyamel, because by this point, there's kind of a path up in management for people at United Fruit. You went to college, and after you got your degree, you went and you took like a junior management role or whatever with United Fruit, and then after X amount of years, you moved up, and then you kind of could plot your promotions into where your career was going. And while that's great for some people, there are other people who were more hungry and wanted to be a part of this fast-growing company and that sort of thing. And so they went over to Cuyamel. It's kind of like software developers in Silicon Valley who can go and work for Google or Facebook, or they can go and work for a little startup. So it was kind of reminiscent of that to me. And like I'd mentioned with the whole people rising through the ranks of United Fruit. One such person was Victor Cutter, who was the current president of the company. He was, classic example of one of these kids. He had come out of Dartmouth. He was someone who was from the upper class in the United States. He got a job working for United Fruit, and he worked his way all the way up to being the president. And Cutter will play an important role kind of throughout the rest of the story, I'd say. He and Zemurray kind of become the protagonist, antagonist, and if you want to look at it like that, in what will become the Banana Wars.
Right, so this competition between Cuyamel and United Fruit Company that we have seen more and more over employees, but also the fact Cuyamel is growing so very fast, whereas United Fruit Company is still by far the largest company, but it sees this creeping up competitor. That is one of the reasons why we have the Banana Wars. But the specific reason why we have the Banana Wars was that Zemurray, as usual, pretty emboldened, very much convinced of his own power and ability to manage things, grew to some degree, maybe not greedy, but at least audacious. What he did specifically was that he crossed from Honduran territory over the Utila River into Guatemalan territory. And that Guatemalan territory was supposed to be property of the United Fruit Company. But because Sam had, as you remember, helped Bonilla to power, and Bonilla had granted Sam 24,700 acres of uncleared land, some of which was on the Guatemalan side, Zemurray felt that it was his land. And that land takeover erupted the Banana Wars that would hold on from, or that would last really, and that started the Banana Wars that really started in 1915 and didn't end until 1928.
First of all, I kind of like to think of this as the Archduke moment for the Banana Wars. It's crazy too, and we'll talk about this, but this Banana War between these two companies almost became a real war with two nations fighting each other.
Right, so we might laugh about it at this moment, but of course for the people, especially farmer involved in it, it was quite dramatic. But it wasn't essentially a war of people getting killed over and over, but water lines were broken, equipment was smashed by both sides, even trucks were knocked over. And, making clear that Zemurray was anything but innocent, weapon cages were found in Zemurray's possession all over the United States, especially, of course, in New Orleans.
One of my favorite things to come out of this, or little anecdotes to come out of this, was this idea that of the disputed territory, there was a dispute about who owned it. There were multiple owners that at one point United Fruit wanted to buy from and Zemurray both wanted to buy from the same plot of land that may have been owned by two different parties. And kind of in the way of a giant corporation, United Fruit lawyers up and they're getting ready to take this to court and find out who owns the right. Well, Sam was like, screw it. And he bought the land twice. Just went to both parties, paid them both, and was like, okay, well, whoever actually held the deed, I hold both of the deeds now.
I'm glad you said that, Arif, because I claimed that it was United Fruit Company territory when it was disputed.
Through all of this, there are real implications here about, there might actually be violence. And so Cutter and Zemurray are both sort of summoned to D.C. to receive their lashes from the government. And they're basically urged to merge the company, which is kind of ironic. United Fruit had been pressured by the government not long before this about, antitrust, and now they're telling the biggest fruit company in the world and one of its main competitors that maybe you should become one company.
Right, and in this case, they were even assured that they would definitely not be tried for utterly disregarding antitrust laws. So even though now both companies combined would own 2/3 of the banana market, they were allowed to do so. And this really flew in the face of earlier precedents when in the early 1900s and 1910s, several times the government had almost put into place antitrust laws to break up either company, and now United, it was fine. Now, why was it fine? Well, because the United States government preferred stability in Central America over actually enacting its antitrust laws. And that, by the way, is a very important theme in U.S. foreign relations. The United States wants Central America and Mexico to be calm. It doesn't like uproar. It doesn't like revolution. It wants things to be calm, and it will set in place whatever it can to stabilize the backyard of the United States so as to tranquilize the United States proper.
Well, and that is basically a theme throughout United States foreign policy, period. Not even just in Latin America. You can see that over and over again as they're willing to prop up dictators because they view them as stable in all kinds of different arenas.
Right. And unrest really only is welcomed by the United States abroad if someone is in power that they don't like.
Exactly. But anyway, going back to this merger, Sam didn't love the idea, But it's important to understand, we've talked about how Sam had become successful and all that stuff, but like it's hard to overstate how successful. Sam was a very wealthy man by this point, and a lot of his wealth was wrapped up in the company. He owned 100% of it. His main asset was his company. And not to mention the fact that the stock market was crashing during this period. This is November 1929. And so while their companies, Cuyamel and United Fruit, their stocks weren't really crushed by this point, they kind of saw the writing on the wall. Like stuff was going to start falling. So if they can do this now, they might be able to get more value out than they will be very soon.
Right. And so scholars really fall into two camps or maybe mix them together. But why did he commit to that? Well, one, it could again speak to Zemurray's enormous sense of business acumen, taking risks that pretty much always paid off for him. The other part is that as negotiations were underway of combining Cuyamel and the UFCO or United Fruit Company, that he was pretty inebriated when he signed the papers.
Whatever the reason or reasons were for Sam agreeing to this merger, he did, and it was structured as a stock swap. So basically, all of Sam's company, the Cuyamel Fruit Company, all of the shares that were owned by Sam and by his investors were to be sold to United Fruit, who instead of paying them out in cash, as they would have if they just sold them on the open market, United Fruit paid them in United Fruit stock. So Sam received roughly 300,000 shares valued at about $30 million then, which is the equivalent of $433 million today. He now owned the majority of United Fruit's stock and became one of the richest men in America. United Fruit Company now had 3 million acres, which is more land than several small countries. One thing that was important to Sam in this whole deal was that he wanted Cuyamel to become a division of United Fruit, not to just have all of its assets and resources absorbed. He wanted to still kind of operate independently. And what this did was it ensured that Sam's management team, they didn't all just lose their jobs all at once. And so they continued to kind of operate with the sort of efficiency or whatever that Sam had instilled in them, at least for a while. One thing about this, though, was that one of the big reasons for this merger was that United Fruit Company wanted to see Sam go away. And so that was part of the deal, too, was that Sam was not to really interfere with the goings-on of United Fruit, and he certainly was not to go and start another competing company.
Right, but with a very important loophole to which we'll get back later. It did not allow him to start, fund, participate in, or create a rival company. It did not exclude him from taking over the company.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert.
But that wasn't on Sam's mind initially. It seems from reading Cohen and from his sources that Sam really did at this point intend to retire and kind of be a family man. He was extremely wealthy. He returned to New Orleans. And, we mentioned that in the early days of growing Cuyamel, he had not spent necessarily a ton of time with his family. And so he made his millions, and now he was going to actually settle in and have a family life. It's an interesting point that Cohen makes that at this point right now, again, I know I said this earlier before about when Sam made his first $1 million or whatever, or $100,000, that if the story had stopped there, it would have been an interesting story. And again, if the story had stopped right here, it would have been a fantastically interesting story. A man had become fabulously wealthy. He had basically overthrown a government. He had maybe committed treason and still managed to become extremely wealthy all in the process. So again, Sam's story could have ended here and been interesting. But anyway, like we said, he returned to New Orleans in the winter of 1930. He's 53 years old. He purchased a home in 1917 and had it rebuilt into a white antebellum style mansion, which wasn't completed until 1930. One fun fact about that is that after Sam died, he gifted that home to Tulane University, which is actually the home of the president of Tulane. So whenever Tulane has a new president, they live in Sam Zemurray's old house. He also bought a plantation near Hammond, Louisiana, which from reading Cohen, it sounds like that was kind of his getaway. when Sam was tired of being a family man, he would go there. And in terms of his family, his wife, Sarah, she liked to write. She published cookbooks. Doris, his daughter, loved to travel with Sam. So they went to Honduras several times together, and she was quote unquote daddy's little girl, and they would go around together all the time. Sam also had a son, Sam Jr., and by all accounts, Sam Jr. was Sam Sr.'s pride and joy. Like his father, Sam Jr. was also a very large man. He was 6'6". He played football and boxed for Tulane before going to study business at Harvard. Sam really saw Sam Jr. as his legacy, as, the person who would carry on the family name and all those kinds of things. But Marcus, do you want to talk about Sam's philanthropy?
Yeah, so, I wonder sometimes about his motives. Obviously, a lot of wealthy people like to give to philanthropy because it makes them feel better, or because they have a good heart and want to help society, give back to society along those lines. Also, because they don't know what to do with their money. How many houses can you own? How many cars can you have? Or today's you would say, of course, how many yachts? One interesting take on Zemurray's philanthropy was that he was listening to a close advisor who would become very, very important later on, a PR person named Edward Bernays.
And I just want to say, before we go far into this, that Edward Bernays is definitely someone that Melvin and I will cover at some point, because he is a very fascinating figure in and of himself, maybe one of the world's greatest manipulators.
Exactly. That's a very good point, and I'll be sure to listen to that episode as well. Yeah, Bernays, not to destroy your episode here, but one of the interesting things that he did was, for instance, in the 1920s, he was working for the tobacco industry as a lobbyist, something, of course, that is not tainted whatsoever then or today. And he sought to get women to smoke more in public. So it already, of course, if you think of the Roaring Twenties, became more obviously the case that women were smoking in public, but usually was just in dance halls or in their own homes, but never out on the streets. And that's one of his objectives. And so that very PR person, Edward Bernays, and Zemurray had developed a close relationship. And Bernays very pragmatically said, if you give to philanthropy, if you donate to Tulane and others and make a name for yourselves, your image is going to improve, and therefore it's also going to be good for business. Which perhaps is not the newest thought, but I think rarely ever do we have such a smoking gun where a PR person actually advises someone to do that, and then that's what happens.
Yeah, and knowing just the little bit that I do know about Bernays, that is exactly in line with like everything that he did. He was masterful at manipulating the public basically to want a product without even realizing it. He worked for huge firms, and fun fact, his uncle was Sigmund Freud.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and he actually credits the work of Uncle Sigmund with a lot of the ideas that he had.
That is odd, to say the least. Interesting, though, about his philanthropy, whatever the reasons were behind the philanthropy, whether it was just selfishly motivated or his soft spot, or it could be a mixture of both, really. What is interesting is that his donations to Tulane helped create the so-called Middle American Research Institute. And now it's not about Americans in the middle class, it's about Mesoamerica, Central America. And so his daughter and his grandson actually, down the road, became famous at least in the very confined, small ivory tower circles, became famous in the academic world for being Mesoamerican experts, important historians and cultural experts. So also interesting how in that sense perhaps the circle closes with someone who is very much invested in business in Central America and his family taking up the mantle.
Whatever Sam's motives were for donating, he donated quite a bit of money. And rather than me or Marcus try to sum it all up, I figured I would just read it from Cohen's. He has a paragraph on page 129 for any of you readers at home. He says that Zemurray gave money to establish a clinic for troubled children in New Orleans, funded the city's first hospital for quote-unquote Negro women, and at the urging of his daughter made a $250,000 gift to Radcliffe College to endow a professorship at Harvard, an endowment that resulted in the first woman professor on the Arts and Sciences faculty of the university. It's called the Samuel Zemurray Jr. and Doris Zemurray Stone Radcliffe Professor of the History of Science. He gave vast amounts to The Nation magazine, which is a progressive magazine that's still in existence to this day, which had fallen on hard times, and more to found the Zamorano and the Pan American Agricultural School, which is a short drive from Tegucigalpa, which I probably just butchered, I apologize, still considered among one of the best schools of its kind in Central America. The Zamorano was tuition-free. Graduates were discouraged from taking jobs in the banana industry. Zemurray wanted to build an educated Central American class independent of the trade. The over-reliance of the people on the fruit companies had become a problem for everyone. He had a passion for giving money on the isthmus. His charity in Central America included hospitals, highways, power grids, seawalls, levees, orphanages, and schools. There was a saying in New Orleans, if you want something from Sam Zemurray, ask for it in Spanish. Perhaps most significant, he helped create the Middle American Research Institute at Tulane, a center with origins in Amoa, where a plantation manager set a grinning little idol on Zemurray's desk. And it's funny, I'm not going to go into it because of some of the language used, but apparently what happened was that Sam asked, what the F is it? And the guy says, I don't know, but we keep finding them in the fields. So Sam says, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $1 for every one of those that you bring in here. And basically, in that way, as the legend goes, Zemurray amassed one of the most important collection of Mayan artifacts in the world. Idols, statues, dinnerware, and hundreds of, I don't know how to say that word, other artifacts, basically, were sent to New Orleans, where they were among the founding treasures of MARI.
It really seems counterintuitive, not just, I think, to all listeners, but even to me, that Zemurray saw himself very much steeped in the tradition of the New Deal. So the New Deal, as we all remember from school, of course, was a very ambitious set of reforms to help blue-collar workers and, generally speaking, older people, people with handicaps, to have more of a social safety net. With the very, very important caveat, of course, that African Americans and also women generally were marginalized in the New Deal and did not benefit half as much from the New Deal, but nonetheless a very ambitious set of reforms, and Zemurray supported that. And as a matter of fact, he did not just support the New Deal, he even thought it didn't go far enough. Maybe similar to Huey Long, one of his closest enemies, who also thought that the New Deal didn't go far enough to help Americans.
Well, Huey Long is an interesting figure in and of himself that
Sure.
I think we may cover in the future, because kind of like a classical example of a populist,
Right.
Rising through the ranks and making this run. And apparently, by all accounts, a lot of people really thought that he had a shot at challenging Roosevelt for the presidency. And Long's story is a much, no pun intended, longer tale that we can get into. But basically, he and Zemurray are huge enemies. Whereas, like Melvin and I talked about in the Carnegie episode, how Carnegie kind of became the symbol of evil wealth and robber barons and that sort of stuff. And Huey Long kind of used Zemurray in that same way.
Why don't you say that?
I'm saying it right now. We're recording. And he is a figure that really uses Zemurray in a lot of his speeches and a lot of all this stuff to paint him as like everything wrong with America. And eventually, though, Long ends up getting assassinated, and that obviously puts an end to his political ambitions. But yeah, just interesting all around.
And of course, the New Deal that was embraced by FDR and also by Huey Long to some degree didn't come out of a vacuum. It was a reaction to the demands by workers more than anyone else who wanted a greater safety net, and it was really trying to address that need. Because the situation was so dire, 25% unemployment, millions of accounts wiped out, people wanted a change.
I think it's hard for people to think today about the state of the economy then. People can look back to 2008 and think of that as a really bad time for the economy, but 2008 was nothing compared to what they were going through at the time of FDR and what he was trying to do with the New Deal. But anyway, Sam is a wealthy person, but he's living through this too, and bad economy is bad economy. By 1931, his view of the state of the United States was quite abysmal. He really thought that the country was teetering on the edge of total economic collapse, and his prospects weren't much better. You have to remember that most of Sam's net worth was tied to United Fruit stock. And although United Fruit had not initially been affected too badly by the 1929 crash, its stock was in the gutter by this point. It had followed the rest of the economy right to the floor. It was now worth a tenth of what it was worth when Sam got it in the Cuyamel sale. So whereas Sam had been worth $30 million in 1931 dollars, he was now only worth $3 million, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. That's a gigantic drop. It shouldn't surprise anyone listening that Sam was a man of action, or at least that's how Cohen depicts him. And he couldn't just sit there and watch United Fruit fall to pieces, especially because he was the majority owner of it.
Yeah, and he was not just a man of action. He knew what he was worth, and he had an overinflated ego, to say the least.
He did have an overinflated ego, but I will say that he also very likely knew the business better than anyone who was running United Fruit.
Right.
That's a point that I don't actually recall whether or not we made earlier on, but Sam working on the ground when he was originally starting the Cuyamel Fruit Company really gave him a granular understanding of the entire business, whereas a lot of these people, especially the decision makers at United Fruit, didn't have it. Just like Victor Cutter, who was the president, he was a Dartmouth-trained guy who barely spent any time on the ground, certainly wasn't swinging a machete with workers at any time in his life. So Sam knew that if anyone could actually correct what was going on with United Fruit, it was probably him.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point that you're making there, because it just seems to me that not just what Cohen is saying, but it almost seems to be just a general wisdom that the first generation entrepreneurs that really start the business always know it best, and as soon as they leave, the company just isn't quite the same. And of course, Steve Jobs comes to mind, perhaps with Tim Cook.
Speaking to exactly what you just said, Cutter was actually the first non-founder to run United Fruit. He had taken over, I believe he might have taken over directly from Preston, but he was the first one who wasn't involved in the founding of the company. And so, they were handing the business over to someone who wasn't boots on the ground, really. So Sam is watching United Fruit fall to pieces, and he knew he needed to do something. But instead of going directly to the top executives, which he considered them the problem, and he was pretty much correct, he went to the docks in New Orleans, and he would hang out there like all day, and he would talk to the ship captains, he would talk to the sailors about like, what are you seeing? What are the problems? Through speaking with these captains and these sailors, he discovered that the United Fruit executives were basically, this is kind of crazy to me, were instructing the ship captains to travel at half speed to conserve fuel in an attempt to save money. Well, that's fine. They were saving on fuel, but the result was that they ended up with a ton of overripe bananas that couldn't be sold and lost revenue. He figures this out and a litany of other problems from talking to people. In June 1932, he says, okay, I'm actually going to go and talk to some decision makers. And so he heads off to Boston to sit with the board of directors of United Fruit. He offers to help. Again, kind of going back to the fact that Sam was an outsider. He remains an outsider. As one of the most wealthy people in the country, still didn't matter. He was basically talked down to, disrespected the whole time. You got to remember, this kind of goes back to the merger. They wanted Sam out of their hair, and that's exactly how they acted when he came to meet them.
Yes, and it also goes to culture, religion, and race. Those are WASPy directions, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There's no room for Jews, West or East European at that moment in U.S. Society. Really, the stigmatization and anti-Semitic bias, which of course still exists today, but that stigma at least wasn't mitigated until the horrifying experience of the Holocaust, when it became less acceptable to be openly anti-Semitic.
Right. And, we haven't really pointed out a ton throughout this episode or series, but Cohen does that. Zemurray always spoke with a really heavy Eastern European accent. And so especially like people like these execs at United Fruit would kind of use that, and they would, make Sam repeat things over and over again as if they couldn't understand him and that sort of stuff. And they really used that to like talk down to him and belittle him. He was furious. Sam was not the kind of person who was just going to take this kind of treatment. And it's even more crazy to me to think of the fact that Sam was the majority shareholder in the company. Sam technically owned more of this company than anyone else. This was theoretical influence, though. He didn't have actual decision-making influence. So what do? You go and you get it. You go get that influence. And so what Sam needed to do was to basically travel to other investors in the company and make them understand what he knew. And when he did that, they were like, well, holy crap, we need to fix something. And so Sam says, okay, that's fine. Just give me your proxy, which basically is your voting rights. And so this is my favorite. So he's back in Boston. January 1932, basically goes through the same exact scenario again. He explains what's going wrong, how he can help. And again, this whole thing with language comes up again, and they're telling him, oh, we can't understand you. Sorry, Sam, we can't understand you. And so he, this time, leaves, goes down to wherever he had all this briefcase full of proxies, which were physical documents, and he comes back and he slams them down on the desk of the chairman of the board, and he says, you're fired. Can you understand that? Which is just a beautiful line.
Right, and even more beautiful was what he said to the other United Fruit Company board members. And he said, you gentlemen have been effing this business long enough. I'm going to straighten this out.
You gotta love it. You gotta love these one-liners. But so with that, Sam basically had completed a takeover of United Fruit Company. The fish had eaten the whale. He fired most of the board. He immediately fired Cutter and named himself president and managing director of operations.
Yes, and by the way, that quote that is not just part of the title of the book really comes from the New York Times as they observed this small individual businessman taking over the reins of the company.
And again, one more of those instances where if the story ended here, it would be a fantastic story to tell.
And it could have been a fantastic story to end here because United Fruit Company was doing so much better in the 1940s than it had been in the 1930s. But by the 1950s, Zemurray and others did not know the limits.
So word quickly spreads of Zemurray's taking over of United Fruit. And according to Cohen, I don't know if this was actually true or not, his takeover was celebrated on the Isthmus. Workers had really struggled under the former regime, and they saw, apparently, again, according to Cohen, they viewed Sam as quote-unquote one of their own. One thing is for sure, though, the company started out by doing way, way better under Sam than it had been doing under Cutter and that whole group. He began his tenure as president of United Fruit with a 6-week tour. And in his fashion, he went and he talked to the rank and file. He went and he spoke to the people who managed the plantation, some of the plantation workers. He wanted to understand what they thought were the problems. And one of the main things that they said was that United Fruit, being a giant company that it was, would just give down these orders from on high. But they basically ignored the management on the ground. And so Sam's whole philosophy was that you need to hire managers who you can trust to make decisions. They shouldn't have to ask you over and over again for permission. You're putting them in positions to make decisions because they're good at making decisions. And so Sam actually toured through and ended up firing a lot of the United Fruit managers and installing his old Cuyamel fruit managers into places that needed major reform. Sam also had discovered that United Fruit workforce had become very bloated. There was tens of thousands fired, up to 25% of the workforce. And, as a result of all of his actions, the stock price doubled in the first 6 weeks.
And think about this, what this layoff and doubling of the stock price says about the economy and the overall interplay. Yes, the company became more efficient, leaner, but it also should make us skeptical of claims that the stock market automatically represents an improvement of the economy, considering the tens of thousands of people who were laid off.
That's a good point, because really what the stock market is not necessarily representative of the economy as a whole. A lot of people kind of use them interchangeably, but what the stock market is showing is how much money these companies are able to make, or at least generate for their shareholders, or in some cases, not even how much money they're able to generate for their shareholders, is how much they're able to make it look like their company is worth more. So in a lot of cases, it's not actually indicative of a more healthy economy. It is indicative of executives being able to convince stockholders to buy their company. But getting back to Sam and what he was dealing with as the president of United Fruit, we mentioned in the first episode that the nature of bananas is that because they're basically all clones of some Prometheus banana, they really lend themselves to being wiped out by disease, blight, whatever. And one of those diseases, we'll call it, was called Sigatoka, and it's a fungus whose spores are airborne. Bananas are extremely vulnerable because, like I said, they're basically clones. Sigatoka started in Fiji, but eventually found its way via boat, train, mud-caked boot to Colombia, and stuck to the Big Mike. So this was causing a ton of trouble for United Fruit. They were losing a ton of bananas. And in an attempt to cure the Big Mike and crush Sigatoka, Sam had United Fruit chemists concoct an antidote that was extremely poisonous. Now, according to Cohen, the United Fruit workers knew how poisonous this was, but they chose to stay on and work anyway because they were receiving hazard pay, which was some multiplier of whatever they're usually paid. These workers really suffered as a result of working around this antidote because, they lose their sense of smell and their sense of taste, and eventually, if they stayed around it long enough, their skin even began to turn blue, and they were nicknamed Los Pericos, which translates to the parakeets.
Yeah, and you think Sigatoka was bad, and it definitely was bad. Panama disease outdid Sigatoka. The only thing you could really do about Panama disease, which became more and more widespread throughout Central America and really Latin America altogether, was to outrun it. And that really led to this enormous United Fruit purchasing thousands of acres of untouched land so that the fields destroyed by Panama disease could be replaced.
And I just want to interject real quick. The reason that Panama disease was so destructive was because it was a disease of the soil. You didn't even realize you were planting in bad soil and suddenly your entire crop is rotting. So go ahead. Sorry.
Right. No, that's a really good point. And so more than anything, it really is Panama disease that explains why the Big Mike eventually died and why everybody today is eating the Cavendish. So really, Panama disease was the straw that broke the banana's back.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
I try. Now, wealth patterns got so bad because of the United Fruit purchasing of more and more land to escape Panama disease that it really led to cases like Honduras, where the United Fruit Company owned 50% of all land, but actually was only able to cultivate 5% of that land. And it's not hard to understand why both Honduran officials, but also Honduran farmers, were extremely frustrated with this state of affairs. The United Fruit Company owning all this land that was not being used, ruining all this land for years to come. And add to this layer that whenever the United Fruit Company left a certain part of the land, it did not care about the communities it left behind. As a great example is, it just ripped up the railroad tracks, threw them into the water, destroyed bridges, and offered no compensation whatsoever for the jobless communities.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how frustrating that would have been. It'd be like if you live in the United States, some other country, let's say China, just bought up all of the land west of Wyoming or something and just sat on it and didn't cultivate it, and no one was allowed to make any, money on that land. Can you imagine?
Right, and put yourself into that mindset, and we can understand better why there was a challenge from the left, not in Honduras per se, but in neighborly Guatemala.
And that brings us up to World War II, which was very bad for business on both fronts for Sam, because while United Fruit owned a gigantic fleet of ships, and they were getting sunk relatively often by German U-boats on one end, and then on the other end, you have FDR putting pressure on United Fruit because they are continuing to trade with Nazi Germany.
Right, and that, by the way, is not the only company that is trying to turn a buck while the United States is heading on a warpath of Nazi Germany, and Nazi Germany has taken over much of the world, or at least much of Europe. And another interesting example is actually Coca-Cola, which was trying to find a way around Nazi laws that embargoed Coca-Cola ingredients. And the way that Coca-Cola did that was to invent Fanta. And so in order to be able to still have business with Nazi Germany, Fanta was invented and sold to Nazi Germany while World War II was underway. Anyway, back to United Fruit. The fact that United Fruit was still doing business with Nazi Germany brought FDR to the relatively smart idea that in order to adjust the behavior of United Fruit, that he would bring forward antitrust lawsuits. If we all remember, and we all do of course, this antitrust lawsuit debacle had been put on ice in 1928, and now it was resurfacing because FDR thought, well, if I threaten to break up this company, then they will finally come around and be patriotic, and United Fruit will support us in the war effort. And that really is surprising that we have this fallout between United Fruit Company and Zemurray, because if you remember, Zemurray had been a large supporter of the New Deal and other left-wing causes. He had actually even worked for the Agricultural Adjustment Administration under FDR. In the end, what saved United Fruit's reputation to some degree was not just the threat of a lawsuit, but also what else did FDR do?
Well, following Pearl Harbor, as was the case with many companies in the United States who had a fleet, many of United Fruit's ships were called to contribute in the war effort. And in the case of United Fruit, basically Sam was left with the clunkers. All of the highly functioning ships were sent to contribute to the war. 19 of those ships were sunk throughout the course of the war, and the government also set a quota on bananas. So he has all these bananas growing, and they are just rotting in the fields. Sam had to kind of pivot, to use modern business parlance. He switched from growing so many bananas to other strategic materials that were needed by the U.S. military, which, is an interesting strategy because, now he knows that there's a demand for these products, which, by the way, were hemp, quinine, and rubber primarily. He knew that there was going to be a demand for as long as the war was going on, but it also helped to frame United Fruit in a positive light to the United States citizens because they're like, oh, look at this wonderful United Fruit Company who are switching their operations to build for the war effort.
Yeah, and yet again, it also goes to show how powerful United Fruit was. Yes, they had to acquiesce to what the United States was demanding from them, but at the same time, FDR was so grateful for the switch that he put his lawsuit on ice altogether and never mentioned it again.
On a personal note, we have to talk about Sam's son, Sam Jr., who, if you'll recall, was kind of the pride and joy of Sam and of his mother. And he was, as many young men were at the time, inspired to enlist. And so after Pearl Harbor, Sam Jr. enlisted, and he became a major in the Army Air Force. He flew photo recon missions for the Army Air Force. And on January 7th, 1943, Sam Jr.'s plane crashed into a mountain flying a night mission. He was 31 years old. And this absolutely devastated Sam. His body was not recovered. And so for a long time, Sam Sr. clung to the belief that Jr. may have escaped the crash. But eventually he had to come to the sobering realization that his son was dead. And this really was said to change him in a way that, he never kind of recovered from. He was very detached from that point forward.
Yeah, and in that sense, we can really understand how World War II was one of the low points in Zemurray's life. Add to this, of course, the layer of the Holocaust.
Right. And, that is actually an excellent place for us to leave off for this episode. In the next episode, we will jump in right there and talk about the post-war period through the end of Sam Zemurray's life. Marcus, is there anything else you want to add to the end of this episode?
Nope.
All right. Well, then, thank you very much for joining me, Marcus, and thank you all very much for tuning in. As a reminder, if you would like to support the show, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com and visit our support page. Thank you very much.